Daniel Reed had spent 8 years scrubbing marble floors for a woman whose world he could never touch, until the night his 8-year-old daughter sat across from her at a chessboard and made a single move that stopped the party cold and brought the billionaire CEO to tears. Daniel Reed, a 36-year-old man with dark hair and a lean frame hardened by years of work, was crouched halfway up the sweeping staircase of the Hart Mansion. The scent of lemon-sharp cleaning solution clung to him, the way expensive perfume clung to the guests who sometimes passed through this place. In his right hand, a cloth. In his left, the rail, polished so many times it felt as familiar as his own skin. Outside, the winter sun pressed through the tall stained glass window, scattering colored light across the marble steps. In the middle of that rainbow patch, sitting cross-legged as if she owned the spot, was his 8-year-old daughter, Mia. Her hair, black as ink, tumbled in loose strands around her face. She had a hair tie in her mouth and a look of fierce concentration that seemed far too serious for someone her age. In front of her lay an improvised chessboard, squares marked out with strips of beige painter's tape stuck directly to the marble, each figure a makeshift creation from things scavenged around the house. Milk bottle caps for pawns, buttons for knights, a crumpled piece of foil for the queen. She moved a pawn forward with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "Mia," Daniel said softly, trying to keep his voice calm, but the words came out heavier than he intended. "We've talked about this." She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide but steady. "It's just a game, Dad." "It's not just a game," he said, crouching down beside her. He glanced toward the end of the hallway, listening for the footsteps of the house manager, or worse, the owner herself. "Not here. Not like this." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the board, as if he hadn't spoken. With a stubborn little motion, she picked up the pawn again and advanced it one square. Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached forward, peeled the tape squares from the marble, and swept the pieces into his palm. The sound of the tape tearing seemed too loud in the echoing stairwell. Mia blinked at him, not tearful, not angry, but startled, as though he had just taken away something invisible and important. For a heartbeat, he saw another pair of eyes in his mind, brown, gentle, framed by lashes that trembled when she laughed. Lorna. She had sat across from him years ago, a real chessboard between them, teaching him how to see 3 moves ahead. Her illness had hollowed her cheeks but never dimmed her delight when their daughter took an interest in the game. He forced the memory away, straightened, and dropped the crumpled tape into the bucket beside him. "Come on," he said, forcing a neutral tone. "We need to finish here before they come back." Mia got to her feet, slow and deliberate, her little sneakers squeaking on the polished marble. She didn't argue, but Daniel could feel the weight of her unspoken question pressing against his back as they climbed the rest of the stairs together. The question of why something so harmless felt to him like danger. Alexandra Hart arrived the way. Summer storms arrive, suddenly without warning and impossible to ignore. The front doors of the mansion opened to reveal her framed in a shaft of cold daylight, dressed in a flawless white suit that seemed almost too bright for the marble foyer. Her light hair was swept into a sleek knot at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place, and her brown eyes had that particular clarity of someone who missed nothing and forgot even less. Every movement she made was measured, deliberate, as if she were playing an invisible game in which the rules were entirely her own. Daniel noticed her immediately, the way a field mouse notices the shadow of a hawk. He was dusting the edge of the sideboard in the main hall, his sleeves rolled up when she stepped inside. Mia, crouched nearby with a rag of her own, froze mid-wipe. Alexandra's heels clicked once, twice across the polished floor before she glanced their way. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was low, pleasant, but carried that subtle authority that made people stand a little straighter without realizing it. "On Saturday, we're hosting a charity gala for the Heart for Kids Foundation. We'll need the event spaces in perfect condition." Her gaze shifted toward the great room beyond the hall. "There will be a section called Chess and Thought. Please ensure the tables and boards are ready." The word chess hung in the air like a struck bell. Daniel felt his stomach tighten, an instinctive recoil that had nothing to do with the extra work. He forced himself to nod. "Yes, ma'am." Alexandra gave the faintest smile, already moving on. Her perfume, a clean floral scent, trailed after her like a signature. She disappeared into the west wing, and the moment she was gone, Mia's eyes lit up in a way Daniel hadn't seen for months. Chess, she whispered under her breath, as if testing how it felt to say it out loud in this house. Daniel busied himself with the sideboard, avoiding her gaze. He could almost hear the question forming in her head, the request she wouldn't dare speak in front of the mansion's owner. Later, in the small windowless supply room, he stood with the house manager, a trim man with a permanent frown etched into his forehead. Do we really need the chess setup? Daniel asked, keeping his tone casual. We could focus on the reception hall instead. Make it perfect. The manager didn't even look up from his clipboard. Miss Hart requested it. It will be there. His voice had the finality of a slammed door. When the man left, Daniel remained alone among the rows of cleaning supplies and seasonal decorations. He glanced up at a high shelf and spotted a long, narrow wooden box pushed into the corner. Pulling it down, he found the lid worn smooth from years of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a complete set of carved wooden chess pieces, each one polished to a soft glow. The White Queen lay on her side, as though she had been sleeping for a very long time. He reached out and ran a finger along her crown, tracing the delicate ridges, and for a moment it felt like touching the edge of an old photograph. Beautiful, but dangerous, because of what it might pull out of him. His hand hovered there a second longer before he snapped the lid shut and slid the box back onto the shelf. Through the thin walls, he could hear faint footsteps on marble, the distant sound of Mia's laugh. And though he didn't want to admit it, the word chess was still echoing in his mind, stubborn and unwelcome, like a song he didn't choose but couldn't stop hearing. That night, the apartment above the laundromat felt smaller than usual. The radiator in the corner hissed and clanked like it was struggling to keep up with the February cold, and the air smelled faintly of detergent drifting up from the machines below. Daniel sat at the chipped kitchen table, bills spread in front of him like a hand of bad cards. He could hear Mia moving around in her room, the soft scuff of her socks against the linoleum, the occasional squeak of her bed as she climbed on and off. She appeared in the doorway without a sound, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She was wearing the oversized sweatshirt he'd bought her last Christmas, the one with a faded print of a cartoon fox on the front. In her hands, she clutched a flyer, creased, probably pulled from the community bulletin board at the library. She came closer, the paper trembling just enough to make the light catch on its glossy surface. Dad, she began, careful, as though trying not to startle him. There's a chess club at the library, Mrs. Rivers told me. They meet every Wednesday after school. She said I could, no. The word was out of his mouth before she could finish. It came sharper than he meant, and her shoulders jerked at the sound. Mia frowned, the paper curling in her fingers. Why not? Because I said so, he replied, turning back to the bills. He could feel her still standing there, the way the air seemed to get heavier when she didn't move. That's not a reason, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. He sighed and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He wanted to tell her the truth, but the words sat like stones in his throat. How could he explain that chess wasn't just a game for him, that it was a doorway to a room he had locked years ago, after Lorna got sick? How could he tell her that the last time he'd seen his wife smile was over a chessboard, pale fingers curling around a knight, her voice teasing him about missing an obvious fork? That when she was gone, he'd hidden the board away because looking at it was like holding a knife by the blade? He pushed the thoughts down and shook his head. Sometimes things look harmless, but they're not. Sometimes they take more from you than they give. Chess is one of those things. I don't want it eating up your time. Or you. It won't, she insisted, taking a step closer. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, were bright with something that wasn't defiance exactly, but it was close. I'll be careful. I'll be fast. Just a few game. No, Mia. His tone was final, and he hated how it sounded. Cold, like he was shutting a door in her face. She looked at him for a long moment, then dropped her gaze to the floor. The flyer crumpled completely in her hands. She didn't cry. She just turned and walked back to her room. The door clicked shut softly, which somehow felt worse than if she had slammed it. Daniel sat there long after she was gone, staring at the doorway she'd left through. The bills in front of him blurred, and all he could see in their place was the image of Lorna sitting at their old kitchen table, her hair wrapped in a scarf, the chessboard between them. He'd told himself he was protecting Mia, but deep down he knew part of it was protecting himself. And that thought, more than anything, made him feel like he'd already lost a round he hadn't even agreed to play. The next afternoon, the mansion was quieter than usual. The echo of footsteps from the front hall had faded, and most of the staff were scattered between the kitchens and the back garden, preparing for the weekend gala. Daniel was in the west corridor, dusting the ornate sconces when he noticed Mia slip past the open doorway. She moved with that careful, deliberate gait children use when they think they're invisible, her sneakers making no sound on the polished marble. He followed her at a distance, curious and a little wary. She turned the corner into the main hall, where sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, painting long rectangles of gold across the floor. There, near the far wall, stood Mr. Brooks, the mansion's head of security. He was a tall man in his 60s, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a frame still solid from his military days. He was setting up temporary velvet ropes to cordon off part of the space for the upcoming event. Mia approached him like she'd known him all her life. "Do you play chess?" she asked, holding up something small in her hand. Brooks looked down and saw what she was showing him, a candy wrapper folded carefully into the rough shape of a knight. His weathered face broke into a slow smile. "I used to," he said, "back in the service. We didn't have proper boards, so we carved pieces out of soap. Helped pass the time. Anchor," he added with a faint chuckle. "Helped you think 2 steps ahead of everyone else." Mia's eyes brightened. "Will you teach me?" Instead of answering right away, Brooks knelt down and drew an outline of a chessboard directly onto the marble floor with the tip of his finger, marking out invisible squares between the shafts of sunlight. "The first thing you need to know," he said, "is that a pawn's not just a pawn. Sometimes it's the start of something bigger. This square here," he pointed, "is B2. From here, a pawn can step forward to B4 if you're bold enough. It's a move no one expects in the opening. My wife used to say it's like sending the pawn toward the light." "Toward the light?" Mia tilted her head. Brooks's expression softened. She loved mornings, the way the sun moved across the floor. Said it reminded her that even the smallest steps could carry you out of the shadows. Mia repeated the phrase under her breath. B4, toward the light. The words seemed to settle into her like a secret she intended to keep. For the next 15 minutes, they crouched together on the floor. Brooks explained how the rook moved straight lines, how the knight leapt in an L shape, how the bishop carved through the board on its diagonals. Mia listened intently, committing every detail to memory. She had no real pieces, so they improvised. Her candy wrapper knight, a button for a bishop, a bottle cap for a rook. They played through small puzzles, Brooks showing her how to see the board not for what it was, but for what it could become. Daniel stood in the doorway the whole time, unseen. Part of him wanted to step in and stop it before it went any further. But there was something in Mia's posture, a focus he hadn't seen in months, that froze him in place. She wasn't just playing, she was building something invisible, but solid, one move at a time. When she finally thanked Brooks and scampered off toward the back of the hall, Daniel turned away before either of them could see him. His work gloves felt tight around his hands and his chest carried that same ache he always got when the past brushed too close to the present. He told himself it was just a harmless conversation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that a door he'd kept locked was quietly, inevitably, starting to open. By Friday evening, the air inside the Hart mansion felt charged, like the breath before a storm. The scent of polished wood and citrus floor wax mingled with the faint sweetness of the floral arrangements that had begun to arrive for the gala. In the grand ballroom, staff moved like clockwork, rolling in round tables covered in white linen, adjusting the crystal chandeliers to cast the perfect light, checking and rechecking the seating chart. At the far end of the room, 3 chess tables had been set up on a raised platform, each one gleaming under its own spotlight. The boards were works of art in themselves, ivory and ebony squares with hand-carved pieces so finely detailed you could see the ridges of the bishop's mitres and the individual curls in the knight's manes. Daniel had been sent in to buff the edges of the platform, a task he tried to finish quickly so he wouldn't have to linger. But when he glanced up from the floor, he spotted Mia standing near the nearest chessboard. She wasn't touching the pieces, just watching them the way a bird watches an open window. Her lips moved faintly, as though she were speaking to herself, or perhaps replaying moves in her head. "Mia," Daniel called quietly, walking over. "We talked about this." She didn't look up right away. "I know," she said, still staring at the board. "I just wanted to see them." He gently took her by the elbow and guided her toward the corridor. "This isn't a place for—" "It's a place for people," she interrupted. And I'm a person. The words came out sharper than he'd ever heard from her, not defiant exactly, but carrying the weight of someone who'd been waiting a long time to speak her mind. They stepped into the quieter side hall, the hum of the ballroom fading behind them. Mia, I said no chess, he reminded her, lowering his voice. You decided that, she countered, turning to face him fully. You didn't ask me. You didn't even try to explain why. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth rose up like a tide, threatening to drag him backward into memories he'd worked years to keep sealed. He could see Lorna again, the hollow cheeks, the scarf covering her thinning hair, the chessboard between them on the kitchen table. How in the last weeks she'd insisted on playing even when her hands trembled so badly she could barely lift the pieces. How he'd sat there pretending to think about the game, when really he was memorizing her face because he knew there would come a day when it would only exist in his memory. Your mother, his voice caught, and he forced himself to look away, focusing on a framed landscape on the wall. Your mother loved chess, more than anything, and when she got sick, it was still there, in the middle of everything. It didn't help her. It didn't save her. And when she was gone, it just stayed. I couldn't look at it without feeling like it had taken her from me. Mia's expression softened, but she didn't back down. It didn't take her, Dad. It was just something she loved. And maybe it could be something we share too. Not something that takes, something that gives. The earnestness in her voice made his throat tighten. He wanted to say no, to put the wall back up before it crumbled entirely. But looking at her, at the determination in her small frame, he realized she wasn't asking for permission in the way a child usually does. She was asking for trust. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. Just don't draw attention tomorrow, he said finally. Stay out of the way. No stunts. No, I promise, she said, though there was a flicker in her eyes that told him she was already thinking about more than just keeping quiet. As they walked back toward the service hall, Daniel caught sight of Mr. Brooks in the distance, watching them with a faint, knowing smile. It made Daniel uneasy, as though everyone else could see that a game had already begun, whether he liked it or not. And somewhere, deep down, he knew the opening moves had already been played. Saturday night arrived draped in gold light and the low hum of expectation. The mansion had been transformed. Where there was usually echoing emptiness, now there was movement, music, and the warm murmur of voices. Outside, a row of black cars lined the circular drive, headlights sweeping across the steps as guests in evening gowns and tuxedos ascended into the glow of the grand entrance. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with the mingled scents of champagne, perfume, and polished silver. Daniel stood off to the side of the main hall, near the service corridor, wearing the closest thing he had to formal attire, his cleanest pressed shirt and black slacks. He was there to watch the staff flow, to step in if someone spilled a drink or if a guest wandered into a restricted area. Beside him, Mia was small and quiet, dressed in a pale blue dress that Alexandra Hart herself had approved when she'd seen the child earlier that afternoon. Daniel had insisted she stay by him for the evening, away from the spotlight. The ballroom doors were open, spilling light onto the marble. From inside came the sound of soft jazz and the clinking of glasses. Alexandra Hart was at the center of it all, standing on the stage in her immaculate white suit, the overhead lighting catching in her blonde hair. Her brown eyes swept over the crowd with a calm precision, her presence commanding without a hint of strain. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice amplified just enough to reach every corner of the room. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Heart for Kids Foundation. This evening, your generosity will help provide educational opportunities for children across our city. Laptops, books, mentorships, and perhaps just as importantly, the chance to learn skills that open doors in unexpected ways. Her gaze flicked toward the raised platform at the far side of the ballroom, where the 3 chess tables gleamed under their spotlights. One of our special features tonight is something we're calling Chess and Thought. In that corner, we'll have a chance for some of our guests to play a few short, friendly matches with local children. This is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to make the first move. Mia's head tilted up toward Daniel at those words, and he felt her pulse quicken through the small hand she'd slipped into his. He shook his head slightly, a silent reminder. Stay put. The first match began with a girl in a velvet dress, playing against a visiting grandmaster who'd been flown in for the event. The second match was supposed to be the same grandmaster against another child, but a flurry of whispers reached Alexandra from her staff. A delay, a traffic jam, the player stuck in a car somewhere across the city. Alexandra's smile didn't falter. "Well then," she said into the microphone, "it seems I'll have to step in. I haven't played a public match in years, but I think I can still manage a few moves." The crowd chuckled in appreciation. She moved to one of the boards, smoothly removing her jacket and rolling up the sleeves of her crisp white blouse. "Who's next?" she asked, her tone light but inviting. Before Daniel could react, Mia's hand slipped from his. She stepped forward, her small shoes tapping lightly on the polished floor. The crowd parted a little, curious. Daniel's first instinct was to reach for her, to pull her back into the shadows, but a warm, steady hand touched his arm. "Surby," Brooks had appeared beside him, murmuring, "Let her go." Mia approached the board with a composure that startled even herself. Alexandra looked at her with a small, approving nod. "What's your name?" "Mia Reed," she said. "Well, Mia Reed," Alexandra replied. "The white pieces are yours." Mia's eyes dropped to the board. The pieces seemed larger here, heavier, more real than any she'd touched before. She placed her fingers lightly on the pawn at B2. The memory of Mr. Brooks's voice drifted back to her. Toward the light. She could almost see the sunlit marble from the day before, the invisible grid he'd traced with his finger. Without hesitation, she pushed the pawn forward 2 squares. B4. Alexandra froze for a fraction of a second. Something in her expression shifted. Surprise, then recognition, then an almost imperceptible tremor in her composure. She rose from her seat, her hand brushing her cheek as if to steady herself. And then, unexpectedly, she began to applaud. Softly at first, then louder. The crowd, confused for only a heartbeat, joined in. A ripple of applause swept through the ballroom. "A bold opening," Alexandra said, her voice warm but tinged with something deeper. "I like it." Daniel felt something in his chest unclench, though he didn't yet understand why. He watched as Alexandra sat again, her brown eyes now locked on the little girl opposite her. The match began in earnest. Mia moved quickly, sacrificing a pawn to open a diagonal, chasing Alexandra's rook with a nimble knight, and trading pieces without fear. The game didn't end in checkmate. Alexandra deliberately steered it toward a draw. But when they both leaned back from the board, they were smiling at exactly the same moment. The applause that followed was genuine, unforced. Daniel realized he was clapping too, though his eyes were fixed on Mia, who was glowing under the ballroom lights. In that moment, it didn't matter who had won. She had stepped into the light, and she hadn't flinched. When the applause finally faded and the last of the cameras drifted back toward the main stage, Alexandra stepped away from the chess platform and made her way toward Daniel and Mia. She moved with the same deliberate grace she'd shown all evening, but there was something different in her face now. Less polished, more human. Daniel straightened instinctively, unsure whether he should apologize for his daughter's boldness or thank her for allowing it. "Thank you," Alexandra said, looking directly at Mia first. Her voice was quieter than it had been on stage, but it carried the same presence. "For sitting down and making that move." Then she turned to Daniel. "And thank you for letting her." Daniel started to say he hadn't exactly let her, but Alexandra was already gesturing toward a side door. "Could we speak privately? Just for a few minutes." They followed her through a short hallway into the mansion's library, a room Daniel had only cleaned in passing. The air inside smelled faintly of old leather and sandalwood. Warm lamplight spilled across shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling, each one lined with books in varying states of wear. On the far wall hung a large frame photograph. It caught Mia's attention first, a teenage girl in a white summer dress, holding a trophy almost half her size, her face lit with a confident, joyful smile. The engraved plate at the bottom read, "Alex Hart, State Junior Champion." "You?" Daniel's voice caught, the realization dawning. "You played?" Alexandra smiled faintly. "I lived it. I was competing every weekend from the time I was 12 until I turned 20. Then my mother got sick, and I stopped. The day I missed my first tournament was the day she started chemotherapy. I told myself I'd only take a break, but some things you don't go back to." She stepped closer to the photograph, her gaze softening. "She used to tell me, 'You'll always be playing, Alex. Maybe not on a board, but in business, in life. Just don't forget to make moves toward the light. Mia's small voice broke the silence. That's what Mr. Brooks said. Alexandra turned to her, surprised. Did he? He said B4 was a pawn's step toward the light, Mia explained. That's why I played it first. For a moment, Alexandra seemed to lose herself in thought. My mother's favorite opening, she murmured. When you moved that pawn tonight, it was like hearing her voice again. That's why I... She stopped as though the emotion had risen too quickly. That's why I stood and applauded. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. I didn't want her to play, he admitted, his voice low. My wife, Lorna, she loved chess. It was the last thing she kept close when she was sick. I couldn't watch it without feeling like the game had taken her from me. I didn't want it to take Mia, too. Alexandra studied him for a moment, not with judgment, but with an understanding that felt heavier than words. I don't see something that takes when I look at her, she said finally. I see something that connects. You saw her out there tonight. She wasn't just playing a game. She was building a bridge. To you, to herself, to something bigger than both of you. She crossed to the large mahogany desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a cream-colored card. From a silver pen, she wrote something quickly on the back before handing it to Daniel. We have a program for children of our staff. Scholarships, coaching, tournament fees. She qualifies. And as it happens, we also have a position opening in facilities management. Better pay, better hours. You've already proved you're reliable. If you want it, it's yours. Daniel took the card, feeling the smooth texture beneath his fingers. Why? He asked quietly. Alexandra's brown eyes met his without flinching. Because your daughter reminded me tonight that the first move isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's just about stepping into the light. And because, her voice softened, I think she's going to go much further than either of us can see right now. Mia grinned, clutching the edge of her father's jacket. Daniel looked down at her, then back at Alexandra, and for the first time in years, the thought of a chessboard didn't fill him with dread. It felt, instead, like an open door. 2 months later, the high-ceiling gymnasium of Riverton Elementary was buzzing with the kind of nervous energy only a competition can stir. The annual citywide youth chess tournament had drawn kids from every corner of the district, their parents clustered in folding chairs along the walls, clutching coffee cups and cameras. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings, floor polish, and the faint, sharp tang of anxiety. Rows of long tables stretched the length of the room, each set with tournament boards and clocks. At the far end, under a banner that read, City Youth Chess Championship, a small podium stood waiting for the awards ceremony that would follow the final matches. Daniel sat in the second row of chairs, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He had learned more about chess in the last 8 weeks than he'd ever expected to. Evenings had been transformed, no longer spent in front of the muted TV or lost in his own exhaustion, but bent over a board with Mia, working through puzzles she brought home from the library or replaying games she found online. Sometimes Mr. Brooks stopped by on Saturdays, leaning over the table to point out moves, his gravelly voice laced with encouragement. And every so often, Alexandra Hart would appear, never with fanfare, never staying long, but always asking Mia to show her just one game. Now Mia sat at board 3, her small frame hunched forward, a loose strand of black hair falling into her eyes as she studied the position. Across from her, a boy in a green hoodie tapped the table with a pencil, clearly impatient. Daniel knew from her earlier matches that she'd been aggressive all day, but here she was taking her time, her gaze darting over the pieces as if searching for a narrow path only she could see. Then he saw it, the same little intake of breath she always made when she spotted something. Her fingers moved to the pawn at B2. For a second, Daniel thought she might reconsider, but then, with a steady push, she sent it forward 2 squares. B4. He almost smiled. It was more than a move by now. It was her signature, her way of saying she wasn't afraid to step forward. The boy blinked, frowning at the unexpected choice. That moment of hesitation was all Mia needed. Over the next 15 minutes, she built her position piece by piece, sliding her knight into the perfect outpost, locking down his rook with a bishop, and finally, trapping his king in a quiet, efficient mating net. It wasn't flashy, but it was clean, precise in a way that made Daniel's chest swell with pride. When the arbiter extended his hand and declared her the winner, Daniel realized his coffee had gone cold. He set it aside and joined the applause rippling through the room. From the back of the gym, he spotted Alexandra standing near the doorway. She was dressed simply today, in a cream blazer over a soft blouse. But her eyes were warm as they followed Mia walking up to shake her opponent's hand. She caught Daniel's eye and gave a single approving nod. The awards ceremony was short but loud. The tournament director called Mia's name for first place in her age division, and she climbed onto the podium, the gold medal glinting under the fluorescent lights. The principal looked slightly startled to be hanging it around the neck of the janitor's daughter, but the applause drowned out any awkwardness. Alexandra was the first to stand, clapping hard enough that others quickly followed. Soon the entire gym was on its feet. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the folding chairs scraped across the floor, Mia trotted over to where Daniel and Alexandra were waiting by the doors. Her medal swung against her chest and her eyes were bright with the triumph of the moment. "You were brilliant," Alexandra said, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "And you didn't just win, you played with courage." Mia shrugged, though she couldn't hide her grin. "It was just a game." "Sometimes," Alexandra said, "the games we play change more than the ones we win." She straightened and looked at Daniel. "You've done well by her." Daniel shook his head. "She's done well by herself. I just stopped standing in the way." Outside, the late afternoon sun poured gold across the cracked sidewalk. The three of them stepped into it together, the gym doors closing softly behind them. Daniel felt the weight of years lift a little from his shoulders. For so long, chess had been a reminder of loss, of what he'd buried to survive. But watching Mia walk ahead of him, metal catching the light, he understood something he hadn't before. Sometimes the things you're afraid will take from you are the very things that can give you back more than you imagine. When they reached the corner, Mia turned to him with a mischievous smile. "Can we play when we get home? Just one game?" He laughed, a deep, unguarded sound. "Yeah, kid, just one game." And as they walked the rest of the way, Daniel realized he wasn't thinking about endings anymore. Only openings. Only the next move toward the light. To me, the ending of this story is not just about a little girl winning a medal or a billionaire CEO clapping in a school gym. It's about how something as small as a pawn's first step can ripple through lives and undo years of quiet grief. Daniel thought he was protecting himself and his daughter by closing a door, but what he was really doing was locking away the very bridge that could connect them. Mia's B4 wasn't just an opening move. It was an act of defiance against fear, a declaration that she would step toward the light even when the adults in her life were still standing in the shadows. Alexandra's tears weren't weakness. They were recognition. Proof that courage can awaken something long buried, even in people who seem untouchable. The beauty of this ending is that it doesn't promise a perfect future. It promises motion. Daniel, Mia, and Alexandra each take their own first move by the close of the story, and that's the quiet miracle. The realization that sometimes the smallest risks open the largest doors. And the best part? You're left with the sense that their real game has only just begun.